Hi, in this lecture, I'm going to give you some basic biological terms. We're going to talk about what makes something living and also just the basics of how biology is organized. In other words, what are the different levels at which biology is studied? I'm going to start with the term biology, which really means the study of living things. Bios means living, and logos means the study of. So the study of living organisms. And it's considering a lot of non-living factors too. So two really important terms to know. Biotic means living, and abiotic, anytime you see a at the beginning of a word, it can sometimes mean without. So this would mean without life or non-living. And in particular, the field of ecology studies the biotic and the abiotic factors in an area. So even though biology means the study of living organisms, there are some non-living factors that affect living organisms, and those are considered by biologists as well. What makes something living? I think this is especially important to understand in today's world because we're being very affected by something that's considered non-living, and that is a virus. So viruses are considered to be non-living. They are not biological organisms, yet they're greatly affecting our lives right now. So what is it that makes something living? And then we're going to go back to viruses and talk about what makes a virus considered to be non-living. And it's basically that it doesn't have all those characteristics of a living organism. But the first thing we need to consider is that living organisms are composed of cells. And I'm going to put that S in parentheses because there are living organisms that are just composed of one cell. Those are called unicellular. So an organism that's unicellular is composed of just one cell. That whole organism is just one cell. This includes all bacteria. It includes all archaea, which we're going to talk briefly about in a few minutes. And it includes all protists, which we'll also talk about. It includes some fungi. All other organisms, though, are what is considered to be multicellular, which means composed of more than one cell. So this would be the plants, the animals, and most fungi. Fungi, by the way, can be pronounced fungi, fungi, and we'll talk about them this semester, especially as they relate to human health. So all living organisms are composed of at least one cell. Second characteristic that makes an organism a living organism or makes something living is reproduction. Being able to make a copy of yourself. And that can happen one of two ways. It can happen through what's called asexual reproduction. This is how bacteria reproduce. This is how a lot of protists reproduce and other organisms that we'll talk about this semester. Asexual reproduction means the DNA is copied and that cell divides into two identical cells. So if you started with one cell that had this bacteria in it and it copies its this is bacteria, copies its bacterial DNA. So now with our two copies of the DNA in this cell, And now it's going to divide in half to produce two genetically identical cells. So that would be asexual reproduction. The other option is, of course, sexual reproduction, in which gametes come together to produce a new individual. So egg and sperm are called gametes. And these gametes unite through what's called fertilization. And that first cell is produced called a zygote. And that zygote is genetically different from the parents. And we'll talk about how that happens this semester through meiosis. When we say identical cells, we mean genetically identical for the asexual reproduction. So two categories of reproduction, asexual and sexual. Third characteristic of living organisms is growth and development. If an organism is single-celled, that growth and development is pretty simple. It's just going to start as a small cell and usually develop or grow into a bigger cell. Multicellular organisms, though, have a lot of complexity in their development. If you think about, for example, a frog going from that little tadpole as a juvenile all the way to an adult frog. I'm not going to attempt to draw an adult frog for you, but an adult frog obviously looks a lot more complex, has a lot more complexity than that little tadpole did. So that would be growth and development in a multicellular organism. Think about a baby human becoming an adult human or a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. There's a lot of complexity in multicellular organisms developing. Fourth characteristic is all living organisms must obtain and use energy from their environment. We're going to talk about two really important energy-related processes this semester: photosynthesis, which is by far the most important chemical reaction that takes place on Earth, and also cellular respiration. You'll learn a lot more about those as time goes on. An important term related to energy use that's important to understand from the beginning is metabolism. And metabolism is a characteristic of living organisms. Metabolism is the sum of all chemical reactions that take place in an organism. This term is really misused. People will say, oh, I have a low metabolism, or I have a high metabolism, and they think that means how efficiently they burn calories. That is metabolic rate. Your metabolic rate is different from your metabolism. Metabolism is an important topic in biology. You'll learn a lot about it if you go on to take human physiology. We will talk about some metabolic processes in this class as well, two of which are photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Okay, number 5, living organisms respond to stimuli. Both external and internal. So an example of internal stimulus would be your blood glucose levels. we will talk about how our bodies maintain a constant supply of glucose in the blood because it's incredibly important, and how the body responds when blood glucose levels get too high and how the body responds when they dip back down again. External stimulus. I'm going to make the plural external stimuli because I'm going to give you multiple. So these would be things like heat, light, smell, sound. Those are the external stimuli that, or just examples of external stimuli that a living organism would respond to. Something related to this is really the next factor, and that is that living organisms maintain what's called homeostasis. Homeostasis is an important characteristic of living organisms. And I'm going to break this term down for you. Really, the term tells you what it means. Sorry, I'm trying to change colors here. So homeo means same, and stasis means state, keeping things in the same state. Homeostasis serves to keep certain factors constant. And usually there's what we call a set point, which we call the normal value for that factor. And if it gets too high, there will be something that brings it back down. And if it gets too low, there will be something that brings it back up. So blood glucose level is another example of something that we serve to keep constant in the body. Things like pH, temperature, blood glucose. Your body serves to keep those constant, and all living organisms have some type of homeostasis that they maintain. Okay, number 7. All living organisms have DNA as the genetic material. Really keep this in mind when we talk about viruses in a few minutes and talk about why they're not considered living. All living organisms must have DNA, nothing else, as the genetic material. And the last one is that living organisms evolve and adapt to their environment. The next lecture that you're going to listen to in this class is about microevolution. And microevolution and evolution in general is also a term that's very misunderstood in biology. So I'm hoping to clarify that for you, especially with regard to natural selection. So this is another characteristic of living organisms. In general, the premise is that there are organisms that are better suited to their environment, and those are the ones who survive and reproduce, passing those adaptive traits onto their offspring. So adapting really is in response to the environment, and we're going to talk about natural selection, which really, that's the definition of natural selection. Okay, so a virus. I'm going to just draw a simple virus for you. There's this protein coat on the outside, and usually surrounding that is what's called the viral membrane. And on that viral membrane are some really important markers that are called the spike proteins or the glycoproteins of the virus. And then inside this virus is the viral genome and some important enzymes. So here we have viral enzymes, which are proteins, And this would be the viral genome. So let's start with the viral genome. Remember, I said, remember that living organisms can only have DNA as their genome. Well, guess what? Viruses can have what's called RNA as their genome, or they can have DNA as their genome. Coronaviruses, which COVID-19 stands for coronavirus disease 2019. So the virus that has been affecting our lives for the past 2+ years is a coronavirus, and it has RNA as its genome, not DNA. Influenza has RNA as its genome. HIV, RNA as its genome. So some viruses do have DNA as their genome. Sorry about that, really sloppy. Okay, but not always. Some have RNA as their genome. This virus cannot reproduce on its own, and no viruses can. Viruses cannot reproduce on their own. That virus must infect a host cell and use a host cell's machinery to reproduce. Viruses are not composed of cells. What I drew there is not a cell. We're going to look at what a cell is in great detail this semester, but viruses are not composed of cells. Viruses do not grow or develop the way living organisms do. They do something called maturation, but it's a completely different process. Viruses do not obtain and use energy. So they don't carry out cellular respiration like all other living organisms do. Viruses do not respond to stimuli, either external or internal. No homeostasis in viruses. But the one thing that they do is they adapt and evolve. Sorry, I'm really writing sloppy now. That's how we are getting variants of the virus, because viruses do adapt and evolve. So if there was anything that would make them possibly considered living, it's they do adapt and evolve, and they can have DNA as their genome. But not always. In fact, most viruses of huge human health significance are RNA viruses. There are no living organisms that have RNA as their genome. And viruses do adapt and evolve. That is the only process that could be considered living. All the other factors that make something living, viruses do not have. And you're going to learn a lot more about viruses this semester. Okay, now we're going to switch gears and talk about how biology is organized. In other words, levels at which it's studied, including the levels at which we're going to study biology in this course. Starting with the smallest, most detailed level at which we can study biology, and that's the level we're going to start at in this class, subatomic particles. There are many types of subatomic particles, but in this class, we are going to study protons, neutrons, and electrons. These are particles that make up an atom. You might think, why are we studying this in a biology class? The electrons in particular for each specific element we discuss are going to be incredibly important in determining which atoms bond with which to form compounds and molecules that make living organisms. Chemical bonding is incredibly important in biology. And to understand chemical bonding, you have to first understand something about the subatomic particles. So we will start with subatomic particles in this class. And then we will build up to atoms. Atoms are the smallest unit of matter that you can break an element down to that still retains all the chemical properties of that element. So let me write that for you. The smallest unit of matter that retains all the chemical properties of that element. In other words, if I had one atom of gold, it would have the same density, the same melting point, the same boiling point. It would be the smallest unit we could break that down to. It would have the same number of protons, the same number of neutrons, same number of electrons as all of the other gold atoms. Anything smaller than that would be considered a subatomic particle. Matter is another important part of this definition. Matter is anything that has mass and occupies space. So this would be the smallest unit of matter for a chemical element that would still retain all of the chemical properties of that element. Here, I'll write the definition of matter for you. Matter has mass and occupies space. If two or more atoms get together, they form a molecule. Molecules are two or more atoms chemically bonded together. We're going to talk a lot about molecules in this class. In particular, we're going to talk about what we call the macromolecules. These are the big molecules that make up living organisms, and you'll learn what those are. The next highest level, or I guess the next, would it be the next smallest or the next biggest? The next level of organization is called cell organelles. And that's not really, it's kind of a funky one because it's not really a group of molecules, even though it's made, cell organelles are made of several types of molecules, but that's kind of the next level we study. It's different from the others in that the previous ones don't really all, it's not all that really makes a cell organelle. But cell organelles are very specific structures within cells. And they carry out specific functions within the cell. Okay, so things like the mitochondria, the lysosomes, the endoplasmic reticulum. These are going to be just examples of the cell parts that we study this semester. We're going to talk about the cell in detail, and we'll talk about those cell organelles. Then the next level up is going to be cells. We're going to talk about many different functions of cells within the body, and you'll learn the various types of cells that exist in biology specific to the levels of organization. And we'll talk about those a little bit more in a few minutes. Actually, that's going to be in the next lecture when I talk to you about how organisms are classified. I'm going to talk to you about prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Those are the two major categories of cells in biology. And I'll talk to you about which organisms are in those categories and what the major differences are between those two types of cells. So that will be in the next lecture. Cells come together to make tissues. So tissues are a group of cells carrying out similar functions. And obviously, tissues only exist in multicellular organisms. So if you're only one cell as all that you are, so unicellular organisms don't have tissues. So they're just made of one cell. This is going to be groups of cells carrying out similar functions. In a lot of biology labs, including anatomy, you look at tissue types and you can see those similar cells carrying out similar functions. They're usually shaped the same, they're coordinating with each other, communicating with each other to carry out those functions. Different types of tissues come together to form organs. So if you took just one organ in your body as an example, so something like your kidney is going to be made out of a lot of different tissue types. So organs are made of several tissue types. And those tissues come together to carry out the functions of that organ. A bunch of organs carrying out similar functions form what's called organ systems. So for example, your digestive system, all the organs of your digestive system are carrying out the function of processing your food, extracting the nutrition from that food, and eliminating those waste materials at the end. So organ systems are really a group of organs carrying out similar functions. And then all those organ systems come together to form an organism. And we've already talked about what makes a living organism, but the very important term associated with an organism is this one, species. We usually refer to a specific species of organism when we're talking about an organism. And species, as you're going to see when we talk about how organisms are classified in the next lecture, species is the most specific. So that's where that term comes from, species, specific. It's the most specific level of classification for a living organism. To be the same species, it means you can mate with that other organism and produce fertile offspring. Two different species of organism could have babies together, but those babies can't have babies. Okay, so the classic example of that is a horse can mate with a donkey. These are two different species. That baby is called a mule, and mules are sterile. They cannot have offspring. There are no baby mules that came from another mule. So once that mule is born, it's a combination of a donkey and a horse, and donkey and horse are not the same species, even though they can produce a baby together. So you have to be able to produce fertile offspring to be the same species. So that's a very specific level of classification. A bunch of organisms of the same species come together to form a very important level of classification in biology, and that is a population. So a population is a group of organisms of the same species. So they can mate and produce fertile offspring. And populations are living in the same place at the same time. They're interacting with each other, they're breeding with each other, they're all affected by similar conditions. And population is a really important level of organization in biology because this is the level at which evolution occurs. Populations evolve, not individuals. Sorry, I accidentally pushed the crayon. I'll get rid of that in a minute. So populations evolve, not individuals. In your lifetime, you cannot evolve. Okay, it's the population that evolves, and we'll talk about that very much in detail in the next lecture. But population is a really important level to understand in biology. The next level of organization is the community. I'm still in crayon, even though I pushed the pen again. Oh, well, sorry about that. Let me see if I can get that. Here we go. I was still in crayon. A community is all the populations of living organisms in a specific area. And the key is that they're all interacting with each other, affecting each other, competing with each other. This is a very important level at which ecologists study biology. So a biological community would be all of the bacteria, archaea, fungi, protists, animals, plants, all living together, some, forming food webs, competing for resources. All that interaction that occurs in a community. There are lots of concepts in ecology that are really significant to that. But the key is that the community includes the living organisms only. This next level of organization is really similar to community, but it also includes the non-living factors that affect those living organisms. And that level is called the ecosystem. So the ecosystem is the abiotic plus the biotic factors of a specific area. And we already talked a little bit about what some of those abiotic factors would be, but really this is the community, right? It's all the living organisms plus all of those non-living factors. So examples of abiotic factors in an ecosystem that affect living organisms be things like water availability, shelter, climate, sunlight, other minerals. So those are all non-living things that affect living organisms. We could keep going with that list. So the ecosystem level of study is very, very interesting. And then finally, the highest level at which you can study biology is what's called the biosphere. And this is all the ecosystems of the earth. These are big issues in biology, such as global warming, climate change, and how those affect multiple ecosystems on the planet. So those are the levels at which biology is studied. And in a typical non-majors general biology class, we cover all of those. And if you're taking Bio 102 because you're pre-nursing, then we don't really talk that much about ecosystems and biospheres and communities, but we do talk about populations. So all the way up to population level would be in every biology class that we teach. And then we would add in communities, ecosystems, and biosphere if you're taking a Bio 100 class. That's all I have for this lecture. Sorry, the tongue is still getting warmed up. It's early in the semester. My lectures will get better. The material will get more interesting and more exciting. Right now, we're just getting a lot of terms out there so you understand those bigger, more exciting stories in biology. So next, we will talk about how organisms are classified, and we will talk a little bit about microevolution.